For 11 days, American satellites tracked something being built underground near one of Iran's most sensitive nuclear facilities. Then, without warning, the signal, the activity, the entire trail simply stopped. No explanation, no follow-up movement, just silence. In a place where silence is almost never a good sign. Everything you're about to hear is a dramatized, fictional account, a hypothetical scenario built for storytelling purposes, not a real confirmed event, and it doesn't describe any real intelligence methods or real facility details. But the broader reality behind this story, the decades-long shadow war over Iran's nuclear ambitions, is very real, and it's exactly the kind of tension that makes a scenario like this one so believable. So stick with me, because this is a story about watching something happen from thousands of miles away, and then losing it completely, right when it mattered most. To understand why a story like this one carries so much weight, you have to understand just how central satellite surveillance has become to how the world actually tracks nuclear proliferation concerns. For decades, American and allied intelligence agencies have relied heavily on a combination of satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and human sources to monitor suspected nuclear-related activity in countries of concern, and Iran has been at the very top of that list for a very long time. This isn't speculation. It's a well-documented, publicly acknowledged reality of how non-proliferation efforts actually work in practice. Satellites capable of detecting subtle changes in terrain, construction activity, vehicle movement, and even soil disturbance patterns have played a real and significant role in identifying suspected nuclear facilities in the past, including some that were never publicly acknowledged by the country in question until international pressure or leaked intelligence forced the issue into the open. In our fictional story, this kind of routine ongoing surveillance is exactly what leads to the discovery at the center of everything that follows. According to this speculative account, an analyst working through a regular batch of satellite imagery covering a known area of interest near one of Iran's established nuclear sites noticed something that didn't quite fit the pattern of activity typically seen at that location. Not an obvious, dramatic change, something subtler, slight variations in soil coloration consistent with recent excavation, vehicle tracks leading toward a section of terrain that hadn't previously shown significant activity, a pattern of truck movements at unusual hours, arriving and departing in a rhythm that suggested organized, deliberate work rather than routine facility maintenance. This is actually one of the most fascinating and realistic aspects of how satellite intelligence analysis genuinely works, and it's worth pausing to explain because it's very different from how these scenes usually get portrayed in movies. Real satellite analysts don't typically stumble across some obvious, dramatic reveal. Instead, they spend enormous amounts of time comparing imagery of the same location over extended periods, looking for exactly the kind of small, cumulative changes that might indicate something significant happening beneath the surface, sometimes quite literally. Underground construction in particular is notoriously difficult to detect directly from orbit, since the actual work itself is hidden from view. What analysts typically look for instead are the secondary signatures, the disturbed earth from excavation, the increased vehicle and personnel activity required to support underground construction, the presence of specialized equipment that wouldn't be needed for ordinary above-ground facility maintenance. In our imagined scenario, once this pattern had been identified, the analyst flagged it for further review, triggering exactly the kind of careful, methodical escalation process that real intelligence agencies use when a potential nuclear proliferation concern gets identified. This isn't a decision made by one person acting alone. It moves through layers of review, cross-referenced against other available intelligence, compared with historical patterns at similar suspected facilities, and eventually briefed to senior officials responsible for tracking exactly this category of international security concern. In our story, over the following several days, additional satellite passes continued monitoring the same location, building an increasingly detailed picture of what appeared to be sustained, deliberate underground construction activity. Exactly the kind of pattern that would raise serious concern among analysts specifically tasked with watching for signs of expanded or hidden nuclear infrastructure. This is where our fictional story starts to explore something genuinely important about the broader real-world context surrounding Iran's nuclear program specifically. Iran has, for years, maintained that its nuclear program exists purely for peaceful civilian energy purposes, while numerous international bodies, intelligence agencies, and independent nuclear experts have expressed serious and persistent concerns about the program's actual scope and intentions. Some of Iran's most significant nuclear facilities, ones that are publicly acknowledged today, were originally discovered specifically through this kind of intelligence work, uncovered years or even decades after construction began, when the facilities were far more advanced than the outside world had previously believed. This real history is exactly what makes the premise of our fictional story so plausible, because it directly mirrors a pattern that has genuinely happened before, hidden construction eventually uncovered through patient and methodical surveillance work. According to our imagined account, as the pattern of underground activity continued being tracked, American intelligence officials began working through the difficult, layered process of trying to understand exactly what they were looking at. Was this an expansion of an already known and monitored facility? Something concerning, but at least within a somewhat understood category of activity? Or did it represent something entirely new? A previously unknown site being constructed specifically to avoid the kind of international monitoring and inspection regime that governs Iran's publicly declared nuclear facilities. This distinction matters enormously in the real world of nuclear nonproliferation policy, because facilities that fall under formal international inspection agreements operate under a completely different level of scrutiny and accountability than any activity happening entirely outside that declared framework. In our fictional story, this uncertainty would have driven an urgent, quiet effort to gather additional intelligence beyond just satellite imagery alone. This is where the story can explore, in general terms, how real intelligence work typically combines multiple different sources and methods to build a more complete picture, without needing to describe any actual specific techniques in detail. Signals intelligence, monitoring communications patterns in the general vicinity of a suspected site, can sometimes reveal indirect signs of significant activity, even without ever intercepting the actual content of sensitive communications. Human intelligence sources, individuals with some degree of access or proximity to suspected facilities, have historically played an important role in confirming or clarifying what satellite imagery alone can only partially reveal. And international nuclear inspectors, operating under established agreements, sometimes provide indirect corroborating information, even when a specific suspected site itself falls outside the scope of their formal inspection mandate. In our fictional account, over the following 11 days, this multi-layered intelligence effort continued building an increasingly detailed and increasingly concerning picture of the suspected underground construction. Then, according to the story, everything simply stopped. The vehicle movements that had been tracked so consistently suddenly ceased entirely. The visible signs of ongoing excavation and construction activity, closely monitored through repeated satellite passes, showed no further change at all. It was as though, almost overnight, all activity at the site had been deliberately paused, or perhaps concealed, in a way specifically designed to avoid whatever level of scrutiny might have already been detected. This sudden silence, within our fictional story, is genuinely the most unsettling part of the entire scenario, and it's worth exploring exactly why, because the reasoning here reflects something real about how intelligence analysis actually works. When ongoing activity at a monitored site suddenly and completely stops, without any obvious external trigger, it raises an immediate and serious question. Did the country involved somehow become aware that they were being watched, prompting a deliberate pause or concealment effort? Or is there a more mundane explanation, a natural pause in a multi-phase construction project, a shift to methods less visible from orbit, or simply a change in priority that has nothing at all to do with intelligence concerns? In the real world, distinguishing between these possibilities is often genuinely difficult, and getting it wrong in either direction carries real consequences, either underestimating a genuine security concern or overreacting to what might simply be an unrelated pause in ordinary construction activity. In our fictional account, this sudden silence would have triggered exactly the kind of urgent internal debate that a genuinely ambiguous intelligence picture always produces. Some analysts, according to the story, argued that the abrupt halt in visible activity was itself significant evidence, suggesting the site's operators had somehow detected the surveillance effort and deliberately paused to avoid further scrutiny while they reassessed their own security measures. Other analysts in our imagined scenario pushed back against that interpretation, pointing out that construction projects, especially complex underground ones, routinely experience pauses for entirely mundane logistical reasons that have nothing at all to do with detection or concealment. This kind of genuine, good faith disagreement among experienced analysts working from the exact same underlying data is actually one of the most realistic aspects of how intelligence assessments genuinely get made in the real world. Rarely a single, confident conclusion, far more often a careful, contested weighing of multiple plausible explanations. Let's take a moment within our fictional story to think through what might have actually caused this silence, exploring a few different plausible explanations. The way real analysts might have approached exactly this kind of ambiguous situation. One possibility our story considers is that the construction, whatever its actual purpose, had simply reached a natural transition point, moving from an initial excavation phase, which produces the kind of visible surface disturbance that satellites can detect, into a more advanced construction phase happening entirely underground, no longer producing the same visible surface signatures that had allowed analysts to track it in the first place. This kind of transition, in real underground construction projects of all kinds, is actually a very common and mundane occurrence, and it would explain the sudden disappearance of visible activity without requiring any assumption of detection or deliberate concealment at all. A second possibility our fictional story explores is considerably more concerning. The idea that operational security measures at the site had simply been tightened, whether in direct response to detected surveillance or as a matter of standard practice for a facility that had always intended to remain hidden from outside observation for as long as possible. In this version of events within our story, the site's operators might have shifted construction schedules to align more carefully with known gaps in satellite coverage, or increased the use of camouflage and concealment techniques specifically designed to reduce the visible signatures that had allowed the activity to be detected and tracked in the first place. This explanation, while more troubling, is also genuinely consistent with historical patterns of how sensitive facilities have sometimes been constructed in various countries around the world, specifically to minimize detection risk. In our story, American intelligence officials, faced with this genuine uncertainty, would have made the same kind of careful, methodical decision that real agencies typically make in exactly this situation, continuing close monitoring of the site, while withholding any public statement or formal conclusion until additional evidence, one way or another, provided greater clarity. This is actually one of the most important and least dramatic realities of how real intelligence work functions. The vast majority of genuinely significant findings don't lead to immediate public announcements or dramatic policy responses. They lead to sustained, patient, often extremely lengthy periods of continued observation, sometimes stretching on for months or even years, before analysts feel confident enough in their understanding of a situation to escalate it toward any kind of broader policy discussion or public disclosure. This patient, unglamorous reality is genuinely worth dwelling on for a moment, because it's such a stark contrast to how intelligence work usually gets portrayed in more dramatized media. There's rarely a single dramatic moment of discovery followed immediately by decisive action. Instead, there's an extended, often frustrating process of gathering incomplete pieces of information, debating what they might mean, and continuing to watch and wait for additional evidence, all while genuinely serious questions about international security remain frustratingly unresolved. Our fictional story tries to capture exactly this kind of extended uncertainty, rather than jumping straight to some kind of dramatic, conclusive resolution that wouldn't really reflect how these situations tend to actually unfold in the real world. Let's widen the lens for a moment and talk about why Iran's nuclear program specifically continues to generate this level of sustained international attention and concern, because understanding that broader context makes our fictional scenario feel considerably more grounded. Iran's nuclear program has been a subject of intense international scrutiny for decades, tied closely to a broader history of diplomatic negotiations, international sanctions, and periodic agreements aimed at limiting the program's scope in exchange for economic relief. Various international agreements over the years have attempted to establish frameworks for inspection and verification specifically designed to provide the international community with confidence that Iran's nuclear activities remain within agreed civilian limits. But these frameworks have also experienced significant strain and disruption at various points, driven by shifting diplomatic relationships, changes in political leadership among the countries involved, and periodic breakdowns in trust between Iran and the broader international community monitoring its nuclear activities. Within this broader, genuinely real context, a scenario like the one our fictional story imagines, a previously undetected or under-monitored construction effort near a sensitive site, represents exactly the kind of development that keeps non-proliferation experts and intelligence analysts perpetually focused on this specific region of the world. The stakes involved in accurately understanding Iran's nuclear capabilities and intentions are considered by most international security experts to be extraordinarily high, given the broader implications for regional stability and the global non-proliferation framework more generally. This is precisely why the kind of patient, sustained surveillance effort our story describes represents such a genuinely important, if largely invisible, part of how international security actually gets maintained on a day-to-day basis, far away from the dramatic headlines that only occasionally surface when some aspect of this ongoing work becomes public. As our fictional story moves toward its conclusion, it's worth being honest about the fact that stories like this one, even purely a speculation, often don't have a clean, satisfying resolution. And that's actually part of what makes them realistic. In our imagined scenario, the 11 days of silence following the initial construction activity would have stretched into weeks, then months, with continued satellite monitoring showing occasional, ambiguous signs of renewed activity, never quite conclusive enough to fully resolve the original uncertainty one way or the other. This extended, unresolved tension, rather than a single dramatic breakthrough, genuinely reflects how many real intelligence assessments actually play out over time, particularly when it comes to something as complex and consequential as monitoring suspected nuclear-related construction in a country that has, for decades, worked hard to keep significant aspects of its program hidden from outside observation. What makes a story like this one genuinely compelling isn't really about the specific tunnel or the specific 11 days of tracked activity, since none of it actually happened exactly as we've described it here. It's about what this imagined scenario reveals regarding the very real, ongoing, largely invisible effort that goes into monitoring nuclear proliferation concerns around the world. Satellite surveillance genuinely does play an important role in this kind of work. Previously hidden nuclear facilities genuinely have been discovered through exactly this kind of patient, methodical intelligence gathering in the past, and the genuine uncertainty involved in interpreting exactly what a given pattern of activity or a given sudden silence actually means is a real and enduring challenge facing analysts working on precisely these kinds of concerns every single day. Our fictional story simply imagines one specific, dramatized version of exactly how that broader, very real category of concern might play out around a single tense, uncertain stretch of time. If this story pulled you in, I'd genuinely love to hear your own theory about what you think might have actually caused the silence in this imagined scenario. Do you think it was simply a natural transition to a less visible construction phase? Or do you think something more deliberate was happening beneath the surface? Drop your thoughts down in the comments, because I read every single one, and this community consistently shapes the direction of future episodes right here on this channel. If this deep dive into a hypothetical, high-stakes scenario kept you engaged all the way through, do me a favor and hit that share button, send it to someone who's into espionage and geopolitical storytelling, and drop a like so more people get the chance to see it too. This channel is built around exploring exactly these kinds of clearly labeled speculative scenarios, always grounded in the real tensions and real dynamics shaping the hidden side of international security. Stick around, because the next story might be even more unexpected than this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.